Hey, Len. It sounds like Bob's having a hard time getting in. Can you hear me, Len?
Hi, folks. We're just going to be starting in a couple minutes, letting people join. Thanks so much for joining us. Hi, folks. Thanks so much for joining. We'll be getting started in just a couple minutes. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We'll be getting started just a couple minutes after the hour to give people some time to join. Thanks, everyone, for joining. We're just going to wait about one more minute to give folks a chance to trickle in. All right, we are going to get started. So, hi everybody. My name is Len Montgomery, and I'm the Public Lands Campaign Director for Environment America. We're happy to be co-hosting this event with Oregon Wild and Portland Audubon. If you'd like, please share your name and where you're zooming in from today in the chat so we can see the breadth of people all across the country who want to protect our forests. I'm joining today from Denver, Colorado, and excited to see where everyone else is from. And I'm really excited to talk to you all about our campaign. We launched this effort to protect our most critical trees and forests in February, and there are more than 100 organizations involved in this effort. So I'm going to start by talking about what we're working to protect. And then I'll talk about climate change. And then Victoria, you can show the next slide so we can see the other speakers. I will turn it over to Bob with Portland Audubon, who will talk about how critical our forests are for wildlife. Then we'll cover the opportunities that we have now to protect them and talk about how we can take action. And Victoria will be telling us a little bit about that. Please feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen to ask questions. We'll probably answer most of them at the end in the Q&A session. And if you've got a more complicated question, we'll be happy to follow up by email. But let's go ahead and get started. So I want to start because I think this will be a question that people will ask. What is an old growth forest? This thing that we are working to protect, what does that mean? So there is no single definition for old growth because that depends on the ecosystem. For example, bristlecone pines can live 5,000 years. Some other tree species may live 150 years. It varies a lot. But what does an old growth forest look like? Age is only part of it. It has a diversity of tree species, sizes, and ages, massive live trees. It's a forest that has developed naturally while recovering from natural disturbances. They provide habitat for a diversity of insects, birds, and wildlife, and we're going to hear a lot more about that from Bob later. And has a mix of ages, sizes, and species in the understory, the under layer, and that makes them messy and diverse. And Victoria, I think you can show the next slide. Yes, messy and diverse. Standing dead trees, felled dead trees, downed logs. These often help the next generation get a start and are often referred to as nurse logs. And it has a diversity of understory plants and healthy soil. So if you've spent time, if you've hiked in an older forest or an old growth forest, you may have, without realizing exactly what you were seeing, or maybe you did, noticed some of these characteristics and noticed the sort of beautiful, messy diversity that is a fully fledged ecosystem. For comparison, and the next slide, this is what a plantation looks like. So this is a bunch of trees standing, but as you can see, they all are, kind of the same size, all standing, not the messy, diverse understory and messy, diverse old growth forest. So that's what an old growth forest is. But this effort that we are working on is about protecting not just our old growth, but also our mature trees and forests. And to explain why that is, I'll share that there are very few old growth forests left. Just saving the remaining old growth is not enough. We also need to recover what's been lost. And mature forests are our best chance of recovering old growth that's been lost. The mature forests are basically the future old growth. These are the trees and forests that, again, depending on ecosystem, but are probably 80 years old and older. And you can't have a forest that's 150 years old in in 70 years if you don't have a forest that's 80 years old now. So we want to recover old growth by protecting our mature trees and forests. So I want to talk a little bit, and next slide, Victoria, about climate change and how conserving and recovering mature and old growth forests is a climate solution. So when people think of the tools we need to fight climate change, it's usually wind turbines, solar panels, electric vehicles that come to mind. And those are all tools to fight climate change, but people don't immediately think of big trees. So to address the threat of climate change, we obviously need to cut our greenhouse gas emissions, but that's no longer sufficient. Today, carbon in the atmosphere is 50% higher than pre-industrial levels. So we also need to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. There are technologies in development that might be able to help in the future, but right now, natural climate solutions are better than any of those existing technologies. Our forests are the best existing technology or solution that we don't have to invent to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. And when trees get big and old, they don't stop growing. Grandmother trees are not old and feeble. They are only becoming more and more powerful. And older trees and forests can store their accumulated carbon for centuries, which is going to be really important as we, move forward, working to fight the climate crisis. And even when the big trees do die, they can hold on to their stored carbon for decades or centuries as they slowly decay on the forest floor. The dead trees that you see covered in moss and laying on the ground are still helping to fight climate change. So next slide. Forests also help us with climate adaptation. So they help us to adapt to the impacts that we're dealing with right now. In addition to carbon sequestration and storage, mature and old growth trees and forests offer numerous other benefits. They reduce the risk of flooding. So extensive root systems, healthy soils with dense layer of moss and vegetation allow the water to be soaked up, and that slows runoff while also filtering the water. So these stabilize water table levels and retain soil moisture in the dry season, and again, help to reduce flooding. Our forests are incredibly important for drinking water. Across the United States, national forests are a huge source of drinking water. And as the impacts of climate change become worse, such as droughts or heat waves, watersheds are going to become even more essential resources. And then another impact of climate change our forests have to contend with are bigger and more intense wildfires. Older trees often are more resistant to fire than younger trees. They have thicker bark, which comes with increasing age and size, and higher canopies that limit the spread of fires. And then in addition to climate, next slide, there are other really important benefits. So cultural use such as canoe building and food gathering, hiking, camping and exploring, mushroom gathering and berry picking, not to mention mental and spiritual well-being, the recharge that we get from being out in the forests. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Bob, who is going to talk to us about wildlife and particularly some species that really depend on older forests to survive.
Well, good evening. My name is Bob Solinger. I'm the Conservation Director for Portland Audubon Society, and it's a pleasure to be here tonight with you all. My neighbor just started up his chainsaw down the street, so I apologize for that if you hear some grinding in the background. But this is an incredibly important issue, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about biodiversity and three species in particular that depend on our older and old growth forests. We do have a biodiversity crisis on our hands. We have an extinction crisis on our hands. And these unique ecosystems provide vital habitat for a huge number of species here in the Pacific Northwest that are dependent upon them, that would go extinct without them. And many of the species that we associate with old growth forests are in fact deeply imperiled at this time. It's estimated that less than 10% of the historic old growth still remains. It's down in the single digits. And how has this affected wildlife? Well, habitat loss, an infusion of an invasive species, disease, and then climate change also threatens what little is left as well. So these are systems that are under tremendous stress at this point. They provide unique habitat attributes. These big old trees provide really unique opportunities for wildlife. Big trees, big cavities, huge snags, down logs, and you can see some of the species that we think about when we think about old growth: marble murrelet, the spotted owl, the coastal martin, salmon. The list goes on and on. The bottom line is this kind of complexity supports biodiversity, and we need to preserve these unique ecosystems. So next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about three today. I'm going to talk about the northern spotted owl, the marble murrelet, and the red tree vole. And I'm going to go through each one of them pretty quickly, but they're all really poster children for how imperiled our older forests are and why it's so important that we protect them. The spotted owl really has been the primary poster child for protecting Northwest forests. That was what the spotted owl, what the forest wars of the 1990s were fought over. The spotted owl was really the first species that people really started to associate with these old growth forests at a broad scale. And it was listed under the Endangered Species Act as threatened in 1990. We were one of the organizations that petitioned for that listing, and it remains threatened under the Endangered Species Act today, more than 30 years later, and it's in much more dire condition than when it was first listed. In 1994, the Northwest Forest Plan was put in place, and the Northwest Forest Plan was a compromise to bring together diverse constituencies in order to get protections in place for these forests in order to preserve salmon, murrelets, spotted owls. But the Northwest Forest Plan did not protect all of the older forests in the Pacific Northwest. It created late successional reserves, which helped a lot and helped stabilize federal forests to some degree, but a tremendous amount of older forest was also left in the matrix where it can be harvested. So there's a good deal of older forest on federal lands in the Pacific Northwest that is not fully protected today. And when you're down to single digits of the historic land base that was there, you really can't afford to lose any more. Spotted owl was in dire condition on the day it was listed. It is in much worse condition today. A 2021 meta-analysis by Franklin et al. That was published in Biological Conservation looked at 26 years of data from 11 study areas. And what it found is that northern spotted owls populations across these studies areas are declining in some of them by 6 to 9% annually, and in others about 2 to 5% annually. Basically, less than 35% of northern spotted owl populations remain on the 7 study areas since 1995. So huge reductions. Today, the spotted owl is not just affected by the loss and fragmentation of old growth forests. It is also affected by an infusion of barred owls. And barred owls are really cool owls that are not historically found in the Pacific Northwest. They were historically found in the eastern United States. No one understands exactly why they came here or how they came here, but the theory is that They came across the plains of Canada, that as the plains were planted, it allowed them to hop, skip, and jump across the plains, arrive in British Columbia, and then move southward. The barred owl looks a lot like the northern spotted owl, only it's bigger and more aggressive. And where the spotted owl is completely reliant upon old growth forests, barred owls can exist almost anywhere, from urban areas in all the way to our oldest forests. So they can exist across a wide array of landscapes. They compete with spotted owls, and they outnumber them very, very quickly. And so today, it's understood that not only is the spotted owl facing extinction because of loss of old growth habitat, but also because of the pressure put on them by the barred owl. And this slide gives you a sense of how quickly barred owls have filled in. It's hard to see it probably on your screen, but if you look at the map on the right-hand side, this is down on the Central Coast Range. The red dots are spotted owls, and the blue dots are barred owls. Again, barred owls suppress spotted owls. Lots of studies have been done that show that when barred owls move in, spotted owls stop breeding. And so now we have a two-faced problem: loss of forest and barred owls. In the next couple of years, the Pacific Northwest is going to face a very difficult decision as to whether we continue efforts to control barred owls. When I say control them, I mean kill them. For the last several years, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has been going out and shooting barred owls in spotted owl habitat to see if that would help them recover. That experiment is likely to become a permanent fixture in terms of spotted owl management of the Pacific Northwest. And it's a very troubling thing because barred owls are beautiful birds. They would otherwise be protected. But because we put the spotted owl in such a dire condition, we're now faced with actually having to eliminate them in certain areas in order to recover the spotted owl. It would be absolutely appalling, and it's controversial as well, but it would be absolutely appalling if the Fish and Wildlife Service was out there killing barred owls, but not doing every single thing possible to protect, preserve, and expand the habitat that caused the initial declines that made them so vulnerable to the barred owl. So incredibly important that we continue protecting and preserving that habitat. Next slide, please. Another species that's a little bit less well known is the marble murrelet. And the marble murrelet is an amazing bird. It's a bird that spends its entire life on the ocean, except it comes inland to nest, and it nests in old growth forests. And so for its entire life, it's out on the sea, never comes ashore, except for to fly inland into our coastal forests and nests in old growth trees. Next slide, please. Marble murrelets were one of the great mysteries of bird biology because no one could figure out where they nested. And they were one of the last species that we actually figured the answer to that question. Somebody who was climbing in the redwoods discovered a nest, and they realized that they were actually coming ashore and that they have this unique life history where they come into these old growth forests and they nest on giant limbs. They lay a single egg right in these mossy beds that accumulate on the limbs, and you can see a marble murrelet in a nest in this picture. Pretty amazing shot. They're incredibly difficult to find, and they need these huge trees with these huge limbs in order to survive. They were listed under the Endangered Species Act in 1992, and my organization was the one that actually did the status report that triggered that listing decision. They were also listed under the State Endangered Species Act in 1995. In 2004, more than a decade after they were listed, a study that looked at a variety of different research projects determined that they were heading toward extinction, that the probability of extinction on Oregon's central and north coast was 80% by 2060 and 80% on the south coast by 2100. So this is a species that, despite the listing and despite the protections that are in place, has continued to decline precipitously. In 2020, Betts et al. Out of Oregon State University did a paper that described the unique challenges this bird faces. Not only is it suffering because of loss and fragmentation of old growth habitat, but also because of changing ocean conditions where its prey base, for example, is declining. And so they talked about the species basically being squeezed both on the ocean and in the forest. This is a species where, as was stated earlier, as Ellen stated earlier, we not only need to protect what is still there, but we need to enhance it. One of the big pressures on marble murrelets is not just the loss of their nesting trees and the surrounding habitat, but also the edges that we create when we've created clear cuts, because predators will come in from those edges. They accumulate along those edges, corvids, crows, ravens, jays, and they come in and predate the nests. So the more edge you have around an intact stand, the more likely those nests are to get predated. The situation has become so dire that in 2021, the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife uplisted the species under the State Endangered Species Act, which is different from the Federal Endangered Species Act, from threatened to endangered. Recognizing that there are so few left, that just a major event, a stand replacing fire in critical habitat, could put this species into extinction in Oregon. So a species on the edge. Both the spotted owl and the marble murrelet are species that we may lose in our lifetimes or in our children's lifetimes. In fact, there's a high probability that we will lose them in the Pacific Northwest during the next 100 years, if in fact we don't do things differently. Spotted owls, by the way, are already gone from British Columbia, and they're pretty close to gone throughout most of Washington. So both species are heading the wrong direction. Both species send a strong message. We need to do better. We need to do more. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk about one more species, the red tree vole. This is a really cool species that most people have never heard of, but very unique species found in our coastal forests, pretty much only in old growth, although they can occasionally be found elsewhere, but mostly in older trees. And this is a species that spends its entire life pretty much in the treetops. It very rarely comes to the ground, and it lives on Douglas fir needles. That's its source of food. It's also its source of water. Dew that accumulates on those needles is sufficient to keep these red tree voles alive. Red tree vole is also a primary source for the northern spotted owl. So the loss of the red tree vole affects the northern spotted owl as well. This is a species that is not yet listed. In 2007, the Center for Biological Diversity petitioned the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to list it under the Endangered Species Act. In 2011, the Fish and Wildlife Service found that it was actually warranted for listing, that it merited listing, but was precluded because there were so many other species in more dire condition that they had to prioritize those first, and they didn't have enough resources to deal with all of them at the same time. So basically in 2011, they said it should be listed, but we're going to postpone because there are species that are even more imperiled in front of it now. In 2019, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service flipped and reversed course without any real basis for doing so and said, you know what, it doesn't merit listing, and we were wrong. Center for Biological Diversity et al., we were one of the plaintiffs as well, sued the Fish and Wildlife Service. And just this week, in fact, 2 days ago, the Fish and Wildlife Service settled that case and agreed to revisit the listing decision, and they have to come back by January 31st, 2024. So these are just a few of the species that are dependent on our old growth forest, a few of the reasons why we need to not just protect what's still there, but also the older forests that will be old growth someday. And we need to dramatically expand protections across the range. Next slide. Thanks. I'll just say, I think this is really a watershed year for our Pacific Northwest forests. It's a really exciting time. The executive order that you're all here to hear about today is a big step forward. There's a lot of other things going on as well. In the last year, the marble murrelet was uplisted under the State Endangered Species Act. That's a mixed blessing in the sense that it puts more priority on protecting that species. At the same time, it sends the message that we've been going the wrong direction and that things have gotten worse. So it's really a sad thing, but it's a necessary thing. At the state level, and state forests have much less protection than federal forests. One of the things that the literature really shows is that federal forests need more protection, but forests owned by the state and private lands regulated by the state are much more vulnerable and need far more protections. And there's real progress occurring on that arena this year as well. Right now, the Western Oregon Forest Habitat Conservation Plan is out for comment. That's a plan that puts new protections in place for listed species throughout much of Oregon's state-owned public forests. The Elliott State Research Forest is moving forward. That forest is a stronghold for coastal coho, marble murrelets, and spotted owls. And a unique agreement that was forged over the last 3 years is moving forward that will up the protections on that forest dramatically going forward. And then there are the Oregon Forest Practice Act Accords, which were negotiations between the timber industry and conservation groups. Oregon Wild was one of the principal groups. Portland Audubon participated as well. That will increase protections on 10 million acres of private forest lands in Oregon. So there's a lot of really exciting things happening on private lands, on state lands, and on federal lands right now. So it's a great time to get involved, and all of these things need attention. They all need huge public involvement in order to propel them forward and bring them to successful conclusions. But I would just leave you with a statement that I think in the 30 years I've been doing this work, what's happening right now across private, state, and federal lands really is unprecedented in terms of the opportunity to advance. We haven't seen this kind of thing in a very long time, really since the early 90s. So unique opportunity, great time to get involved. And I will turn it back to Len right now.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Bob. So I want to just quickly cover some opportunities that we have to really make a difference for these trees and forests. So on Earth Day, President Biden issued an executive order that directed federal agencies. So the two federal agencies are the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is where the Forest Service is housed, and the Department of Interior, which is where the Bureau of Land Management is housed. So the order directs those agencies to define mature and old growth forests, conduct an inventory of mature and old growth forests on America's federal lands, and then adopt policies to protect them. The executive order was a big deal because it recognized both mature forests and old growth. It also covered both Bureau of Land Management and national forests. So that's all of the forests on our federal land, and that's particularly important in Oregon and in the West. And it framed protecting these forests as a climate solution. Previous rules that have protected forests have been established for conservation, and climate was secondary, if part of the conversation at all. So a big deal and a big step forward. However, the executive order does not guarantee that our old growth and mature trees and forests will be permanently protected, and that's why we're all here. So next slide. What comes next? So as I said, the agencies need to quickly develop a policy that will protect mature forests and big trees from threats, and that can stand as a global model. So we need to keep up the pressure and demonstrate as much support as possible from all across the country for both a speedy process. We want to make sure that this happens, that it doesn't get bogged down, that it happens quickly. And we also want to make sure that whatever is enacted is durable, that it's not something that can be easily overturned or, swept under the rug or put in a drawer down the road. So what we're calling for is a rulemaking process that would involve a large public comment period where we can get hundreds of thousands of people involved in weighing in and supporting this rule, and then a federal rule that would actually protect our old and mature trees and forests going forward. So the executive order is a really strong first step. And then we're calling for both speed in the process and then for the end product to be a durable rule that will protect our forests going forward. So I'm going to turn it over to Victoria, and we're gonna switch who is sharing their screen. So let me do that quickly.
Oh, I can do it. And
Okay, are you good? Okay.
Yeah, thanks so much. So hi, everyone. My name is Victoria, and I'm the Forest and Climate Campaigner for Oregon Wild. So my role is to really boost the grassroots pressure from these efforts. And so I hope that I will be seeing much more of you all in the future. We won't simply leave the future of our mature and old growth forests in the hands of the same federal agencies who have spent decades cutting them down. So it's really time for us to, as climate activists, to start ratcheting up the pressure. As Len mentioned, we want to mobilize hundreds of thousands of people across the country to call on President Biden to introduce lasting, durable protections for these forests. And that includes against the threats of logging. But we know that we have our work cut out for us, and we're here to make sure that you all have the tools that you need to stay involved. So the first thing that you can do is to sign up for our email list if you haven't already, and invite your friends as well. Every month we send out media toolkits that are full of information and graphics that you can share on social media, templates that you can use to submit letters to the editor, and action toolkits that contain all of the resources and materials that you'll need to lead and host your own events. And we use these as ways to engage other organizations and grassroots activists across the country. Essentially, we want enough folks talking about this campaign so that forest defense is considered as critical of a climate policy solution as solar power and wind turbines are. But we really need you to help us make some noise. So for the next steps of our campaign, we're targeting the White House, the Department of the Interior, and the US Department of Agriculture. And so we're encouraging folks to write letters asking for permanent protections for trees 80 years and older on federal public lands. So I included their addresses here on this slide, and I want to encourage you to copy them down and write a letter to let them know that these trees are worth more standing. But some other things that you can do are attend local events, lobby elected officials, and take photos any and every time that you're in the forest. This can include logged and unlogged areas, and then post a caption about their importance, tag our campaign, and share them far and wide. But why not get started today? Before you log off of your computer tonight, please take a moment to contact the White House, celebrate the recent executive order announcement, and let President Biden know that you want to see this result in lasting, durable rules that protect our mature and old growth forests on all of our federal lands. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight and for all of the work that you do to protect our forests and climate. Len, Bob, and I are happy to take any questions that you may have.
Yep, and let me get, we've got a bunch already, and again, please feel free to type additional questions into the Q&A feature. So we've got let's see. One question, Bob, you may know may know the answer to this. I may be able to take a stab at it, but sorry, my computer is no. Okay. One problem with monoculture older forests is the monoculture, which is subject to disease and blocking biodiversity. Would it be possible to draw more carbon down faster from new growth with an emphasis on biodiversity to eventually create old growth forests that efficiently store carbon in both the forest and particularly in the soil? So Bob, I don't know if you have anything to say on that from a biodiversity perspective. I can take a stab at a little bit of an answer there too.
Well, is the question about the value of taking younger forests and making them into more biodiverse older forests? Is that the gist of it?
I think, and then that there are some older monoculture forests that are problematic because they're subject to disease and, you know, problematic for biodiversity. So what do we do about those?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's really two answers to that from a biodiversity perspective. One, I mean, too often we've seen the agencies use forest health and diversification of forests as an excuse to go in and just simply log. And so we always need to be really wary of the wolf in sheep's clothing that claims to be doing something when really the primary goal is extraction. That being said, there are opportunities out there to improve the health of forests that have been previously harvested and have grown back in a more unhealthy manner. One of the things that's exciting about the Elliott State Research Forest is we're going to have an 82,000 acre research forest now in Oregon, where some of that work is going to be done to really look at how do you take some of these logged over areas that have come back that are fairly old now and go in there and do harvesting that actually does improve the ecology of the landscape, makes them more resilient, makes them more diverse, grows bigger, older trees faster. There is some truth to that, but I think there'll be some good research going forward on the Elliott, actually looking at what's real and what's not.
Right, and then I think from the climate perspective, it is the case that no forests are alike. So as we've been, you know, working with groups from, you know, all different regions of the country, you know, a lot of folks have identified, you know, that there are particular problems in certain forests with, you know, with monoculture or, you know, kind of historic forest mismanagement. And, you know, yes, I think there are, you know, if there's science, you know, science-based plans to, you know, to make forests healthier and more functional, then we're all in favor of those. But, you know, as Bob said, unfortunately, often those sort of things are kind of cover for, you know, just more logging. So we want to make sure that any any project that involves logging has gone through, you know, kind of rigorous scientific review and isn't just, you know, we're not sort of using something like monoculture or biodiversity problems as an excuse. Let's see, do old growth forests sequester more carbon than new forests? Yes, that's an easy one. So there's sort of two things here. One is that bigger trees absorb more CO2. They have more leaves, more surface area to do the absorbing. And then once the trees have absorbed the carbon, they keep it, which is one of the things that's so cool about them and why it's so incredibly tragic when you know, older trees are logged and dragged out of the forest rather than being allowed to stand and continue to hold the carbon, and then even continuing to hold it as they die naturally and, you know, and fall in the forest. So yes, old growth, absolutely. Let's see, Bob, I think this one can be for you. Is there an opportunity for breeding programs for spotted owl like was done for the condor? Is there anything being done to preserve the genetics of the owl in case they go extinct in Oregon?
That's a great question, and hi, Jeanette. There is a breeding program in British Columbia. It's the only breeding program for spotted owls. Spotted owls are basically extirpated from British Columbia now. It's a relatively small program. It's a cool place. We actually sent a spotted owl from Portland Audubon's Wildlife Care Center up there last year during the COVID crisis. It took a year to get the permits to get it across the border under COVID, so it's quite the ordeal. But that owl is up there now as a non-releasable injured bird. There has been talk of actually doing that in Oregon, and Portland Audubon was approached years ago about the potential for us to do it. But at that time, our facility was not big enough to accommodate that kind of breeding program. We are in the process of starting to build a new rehabilitation center, and I'd love to see us get involved in those kinds of projects. But I think the answer is right now, there's nothing in the United States, but there may have to be down the road. The problem, though, too, is condors are a little bit different. That what drove the condors to extinction largely was, or to near extinction, was lead and some other things that were a little easier to address than loss of older forests and barred owls. So even breeding them in captivity, we're going to have to really address those issues if we're ever going to get them back into the wild through a breeding program.
And then I think there's a two-part kind of statement / question. So the executive order doesn't seem to say anything about protecting mature carbon-rich forests from the extractive industries. That's right. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important that we keep up the pressure and continue to demonstrate support for protecting these forests from logging. The executive order was, a little bit more vague as to what the intention was around logging, but a rulemaking could and should explicitly protect the trees and forests that we want protected from logging, and that's why we're running this effort and working to build so much support from across the country, and will be the groups in the campaign will be focusing over the next couple months on highlighting logging projects and other damaging projects happening now in old growth and mature forests to demonstrate that that logging is a real and present threat to these areas. Let's see. Is it true that an old growth tree that is logged releases more carbon than one that dies naturally in the forest? I think that's well, I guess it's not that complicated. So one piece of it, right, is that the actual logging itself is, with the machines and the trucks and all of that is, creating additional pollution. And then the trees that fall in the forest are, they'll release some carbon, but will continue to store carbon and become part of the, soil and the ecosystem. And Bob, you may have some more to say about that, that process. They're also incredibly valuable for wildlife habitat, whereas taking, felling the tree, putting it on a truck, driving it out of the forest is definitely worse, both from the carbon and the wildlife perspective.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. From a wildlife perspective, both standing and down dead trees are incredibly important. Those are some of the best habitat trees out there. So leaving those big trees out there, whether they're alive or dead, is really critical from a wildlife perspective, as well as from a carbon perspective.
All right, are old growth / mature forests less susceptible to wildfires? It's yes, bigger trees and taller trees are more fire resistant. That doesn't mean that they can't burn. And as I think folks know, we're seeing hotter and drier conditions, which are better for fire and less good for doing something about it. But yes, bigger and older trees are thicker bark. They're taller, which helps with or reduce the speed of the spread. So yes. Let's see. Oh, question. I think this is back to maybe Spot It. When you say extinct in Oregon, does that mean that these species are doing okay elsewhere?
Yeah, that's a great question. When a species is listed under the Endangered Species Act, it either can be listed throughout its entire range, or it can be listed as a distinct population segment. And those are populations that are isolated in one way or another from other populations of the same species. In the case of the northern spotted owl, we're talking about extinction throughout its entire range, potentially. there will not be spotted owls if they go extinct, if they continue on the path they're on. In the case of marble murrelets, there are healthier populations as you go farther north, but there's a distinct population segment in the Pacific Northwest that is on the edge of extinction. So that was what I was referring to when I said extinct in Oregon. Extirpated would be a different way to put it.
Okay, with restricted logging at home, where will we import wood products from? And then basically, will we have to get our wood products from other countries with fewer environmental protections? This rule making that we're pushing for actually won't have much impact on the timber industry. The timber industry in the US, it's less than 10%. I want to say 4%, but I would have to check that. But of their activity happens on federal lands. So this actually won't have a particularly significant impact on the US wood industry, or timber industry rather. Yes, Ted is saying less than 5% from federal lands. So thank you. Let's see. All right. Sorry, I'm scrolling around here a little bit. Many mature forests are lacking traditional indigenous management that occurred for thousands of years on these landscapes. Are they part of natural processes in these forests? I'll say we are, as a campaign, currently in the process of consulting with tribal governments and tribal entities that are, that have traditional land or treaty land in and around any of the forests that would be affected. And there's, certainly, pre-Europeans and pre-massive industrial logging, we had more forests and they were in, in better shape as far as biodiversity. So we're certainly not wanting to curtail any of those kinds of traditional activities. We're really looking to curtail, logging and other damaging industrial activities. And Bob, I don't know if you have anything you want to say about that.
Well, I think there's just a growing appreciation for more traditional forest management strategies, indigenous forest management strategies. I think there's a growing awareness, appreciation, and integration. I think we're seeing something pretty profound in terms of the number of Native American people that have been appointed to high-level natural resource positions under this administration. This administration really has made a priority of that. And I'm seeing it at a local level as well. Again, going back to the Elliott State Forest, which again is about to become a research forest. There were 3 tribal representatives participating in creating that, and part of the strategy and some of the priorities are integrating traditional forest management, indigenous forest management strategies into that effort so we can understand them better. And so we're really seeing it at multiple levels right now.
All right, how does wildfire play into this? We addressed this a little bit, but the protecting old and mature trees will not interfere with the Forest Service's ability to, manage wildfires as they need to protect communities, which should be the top priority when it comes to wildfire management. And in fact, because wildfires are, in part being made worse by drought and, and extreme heat, cutting down the trees that are and releasing the CO2 will just make climate change worse. So, and then as I said, I think in answer to the earlier question, the older trees are more fire resistant. So, again, the Forest Service and other federal agencies absolutely would still be able to do what they need to do to protect communities. And it shouldn't be necessary to cut down older trees, in any kind of massive way in order to do that. All right, we've got a couple more species questions. Okay, so spotted owl is endangered throughout its range, and that's different from the marbled murrelet. What about the red treevole?
The red tree vole throughout its range, yes.
All right, this is just a cool comment. I just read an article today that said they can now engineer wood in a lab, potentially exciting and groundbreaking if it can scale up. Yeah. I'll go Google and find that article. That's if we don't need to cut down trees for wood, that would be exciting. All right. Bob mentioned the barred owl presence is being issued for a spotted owl. Is there a plan to control the barred owls? And if so, what?
For the last 5 years, 6 years now, maybe even more than that, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has been conducting an experiment in which they have been lethally controlling barred owls at a variety of sites around the Pacific Northwest to investigate the efficacy of that strategy for recovering spotted owls. That experiment is coming to an end, and the data is coming out now. It does appear to indicate that when you remove barred owls, spotted owls do begin nesting again in those areas, but it's a very intensive effort that has to be undertaken. It's an ongoing effort that has to be undertaken, and of course, it results in the death of a lot of barred owls, and so there are ethical and moral implications to it as well. The Fish and Wildlife Service in the next year is going to probably be coming out with a proposal and a NEPA process to make this a programmatic effort, i.e. to move from a research phase into sort of a management phase where controlling barred owls is part of the basic strategy for recovering spotted owls. I expect that will be controversial anytime killing of wild animals, especially something like an owl, is involved. There's a lot of scrutiny on that. And also the Fish and Wildlife Service, in my opinion, has a history of scapegoating species for the declines of other species. We see a lot of killing of one species to protect another when in fact the primary problems are not being addressed. My opinion is that in the case of the barred owl, it is probably going to have to be a factor in the recovery of the northern spotted owl. So I think the science is there. That doesn't make it any less unappealing. So over the next year, people have an opportunity to weigh in on how they should proceed forward and whether that's the right way to go. As I said earlier, though, I think if you're going to go out there and kill, literally thousands of barred owls, you damn well better be protecting the forests that caused the declines in the first place and made them so vulnerable. If you're not doing that, then killing barred owls is all the more offensive. So if you're going to do that, you've got to really do more on the forest side of the equation as well.
So what pressure will be placed on private lands to protect old growth and mature forests? That is a good question. That's not something that Environment America or the Climate Forest Campaign is currently focused on. We're really laser focused on federal lands and kind of taking advantage of this opportunity to protect as many of them as possible in one rule. But I know there are groups that do work on that, and work to persuade private landowners. So I imagine there's, there'll be more of that in the future, especially if we're successful getting these protected on federal lands. We'll then need to work to make sure they're protected on state lands, and we'll then need to make sure they're protected on private.
Well, and I'll just add to that, both Oregon Wild and Portland Audubon have been involved for the last couple of years very intensively on looking at private lands in Oregon. Oregon has 10 million acres of private forest land, so small landowners and big industrial tree farms. And we have some of the weakest regulations in the West to protect those landscapes. This has been a battlefield in Oregon for decades. And over the last couple of years, there have been very intense negotiations, 6-on-6 negotiations, 6 environmental representatives, 6 timber industry representatives, led by the governor's office to improve those regulations, especially around the issue of riparian corridors, stream corridors, with the goal of protecting listed salmon and also imperiled amphibians. And so after a couple of years of very, very intense negotiations, we have actually come to agreement. Legislation was passed in the last session, the 2022 session, that dramatically improves the buffers, in particular along riparian corridors on private lands across 10 million acres in Oregon. So there is progress after decades of somewhat futile efforts. There is progress on private lands as well.
Thank you. So we'll take, I think we've got 4 minutes, so we can take 1 or 2 more questions, but I also just put all 3 of our email addresses in the chat. So if we don't get to your question, or you've got, you know, more to follow up on, please feel free to reach out. So I'm wondering if the climate change effort is attracting / forest effort is attracting the younger generations. We really hope it will. Obviously, you know, one place where you can find and organize the younger generation is on college campuses, and they're all everybody is in finals or out on summer break. But I'm really optimistic that we'll be able to get a lot of students involved, both on the high school and college level in the fall. And then obviously young people, are really the backbone of the climate movement now. And we're certainly working to outreach and involve as many climate groups as possible in this campaign. Okay, so next one, when I visited Mount St. Helens a few years ago, I noticed some of the mountainsides had been planted in a monoculture and tree farm rows. What was the rationale for that? It looks really out of place and is a good example of what not to do. I don't know any specifics about that location. I mean, I think replanting a forest, as it turns out, I mean, that's not how forests grow. So, but I don't know anything about the specifics for, why they decided to do that in that way. Although I know it's fairly common in kind of the, the replanting, you'll see that a fair amount. All right, and then do you see a future where the Forest Service does not do commercial logging on public lands because it's so costly if you include the social costs of carbon release during logging? What's the soonest you can imagine this happening? I honestly don't know. The answer to that question, I imagine, it's pretty complicated. There's a lot of factors in how the Forest Service, runs and makes decisions. I can't imagine it would be anytime too soon, just given all of that. But I honestly don't. I don't know. All right, with 1 minute left, we answered all of the questions posed. So again, thank you everybody so much for coming. I put all 3 of our email addresses into the chat. We'd all be happy to hear from you to answer questions or continue this conversation, and definitely encourage everybody to stay tuned, pay attention to this issue, look for opportunities to get involved. We're going to need all of you and thousands of your friends to make sure that that these protections happen. So again, thank you all so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Don't forget to send that email to the White House tonight.